Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to have a conversation with a longtime friend, Ken Stone. And as we've been talking a little bit, we've been talking for the last 15 minutes or so, getting ready. And it's so good to see you again and to be able to spend some time with you.
Great to be with you, Rod. I always enjoy our time together.
I've been really enjoying your videos lately, and I'll probably mention this a few times throughout our conversation, but if people want more information, check out Ken's videos and on YouTube. Are they going anywhere else, or is it just on YouTube right now?
Well, in theory, Rod, I stream them simultaneously to YouTube and to Facebook and to
Okay.
Twitter. But
Oh, who knows, eh?
well, YouTube is the place where we know it's working well, and
Yeah.
there's a predictable way. There's no algorithm to dance through on Facebook. There's none of that stuff going on.
Yeah.
So it's a reliable, easy to access resource.
Cool. So I just want to preface our conversation a little bit for people who are watching. I mean, I've been having conversations that have been all over the map. Some people, when they have a podcast or whatever, they kind of stick to a theme. But my theme has been, I think when you tune into Fuel Radio, you might hear something about marketing. You might hear something. My last interview was with a good friend who's a musician. And today we're going to talk about spiritual stuff. And so just be forewarned, we may go a little bit deep, and and depending on your opinion of things, maybe a little bit off the trail a little bit. I don't know. Who knows, eh, Ken?
It's inevitable, man. If I'm involved, come on, Rod.
Yeah. So if that's not your cup of tea, I invite you to keep surfing and come back when we're talking about something that is that's a better fit for you. So that in sales, we call that taking it away,
There you go. There you go.
So I'm going to ask you this question anyways. I mean, when we first started talking, you didn't really want to talk about COVID-19. But I am curious. I'm curious for everybody, and you're in a different part of the world than I am too. So I really am sincerely curious, like, how are you and your family navigating COVID-19?
Well, I think I'm navigating it the same way everyone is, in the sense that it's pushing some buttons. It's bringing up stuff to integrate. My former wife and I split time with the kids. So our daughters, the oldest just graduated from high school. It didn't really happen. This was her senior year, just wrapping up. So she's in a interesting transition in her life. And our youngest just wrapped up her freshman year of high school, Emma and Riley, both girls. And so they have a week with me and a week with Laura, and that's the same as it's been. But what those weeks look like are very different now. When the kids are with me, we've always had a conversation the night before. What's going on tomorrow? But now it's about planning who's going to be where, because my space is not that big. So, am I teaching? Am I in session? Am I doing a live stream? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But in terms of the basic mechanics of life, I think we're just kind of, I don't know. It feels to me like there's a universal dynamic that's unfolding on the planet right now. And whatever is as yet unintegrated is rising right up to the surface.
Yeah. Cool. I'll get you to say some more about that later. Another question I've been asking people. Well, first of all, I want to say too that Ken and I first met in Lake Tahoe, and I found out that he was a Keating fan, that he went to Thomas Keating's monastery, and I don't know if you remember the conversation that we had over hamburgers at a golf course, and I started crying as
I
I was
do
describing
vaguely
my
remember that.
contemplative
Yeah.
life. And then my wife was grilling you about being a healer.
Yeah, I forgot that part, but that's great. Let's talk about that too. That's wonderful. Did
Well,
she? I don't remember that. Did she struggle with the label? She didn't like that.
I don't know if it was a struggle. I think with our evangelical background, Christian background, which we,
Yeah.
have, we talked about recovering religious people. I feel like I've been in recovery from that for a long time.
Yeah.
Haven't totally abandoned everything, but,
Yeah.
trying to discover the healthy parts and leave the rest behind.
Sure. Sure. Of course.
So at the time, maybe I wouldn't say she's such a caring, loving person. I think she really liked you. I think she was more curious and intrigued that you would
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you would use that moniker, I'll call it. And so here's a question for you. You kind of stopped using it for a while, and it seems like you've added that back on. What's the story behind that?
It's true, Rod. I
Yeah.
did. I left it. I let it go for a long time
Mm.
because it it really started to agitate me because I felt like the idea of a healer. I mean, it never really made sense to me. It was just a way of giving people a description that I thought would be easy to understand
Mhm.
for something that's too weird for words, which I think I qualify for.
Well, and
And
early on, you had an experience too where someone said you were going to be a healer, and it made no sense to you at
yeah,
the time. So maybe you picked up the moniker at that time as well, or something. Oh, I'm a healer. Like, oh, God.
I think so. I mean, I
Yeah.
resisted that idea for a long time. And then the
Yeah.
more I did it, the more I did whatever it is that God does through me,
Mm.
the more I began realizing there's nothing really to heal. So
Hmm.
the moniker of healer is a misnomer from my perspective, even though it might be the reason why somebody seeks me out or seeks anyone out who, professes to be a healer. And I mean, the things that we perceive that need to be healed in our lives and so on. I'm not saying that there's a problem with that. I'm just saying, as I began exploring more and more. And so I left that in place for a long time. And then at some point, I started being more comfortable with the idea of being a spiritual teacher, which I'm sure I've been doing the whole time.
Mhm.
And then I wanted to let go of the idea of being a healer. And so I dropped that. And then more recently, I've written my first book, and my editor, who also is a big Keating fan and
Mhm.
who has been going up to Keating's monastery for, I think, decades, actually. I'm not sure how long Carrie's been doing that.
Oh, wow.
She said to me at one point, "Are you ready to admit what you are?" And I said, "What's that, Carrie?" And she said, "You're a healer."
Oh, wow.
And I started crying, of course, because that's
Yeah.
how I respond to things that resonate at a deep level. And so I've tried to add it back in and see if I can deal with my own little temper tantrum about it. No better way than to face it head on.
Yeah. Cool. I'm just going to keep referring to my questions here. So when's the book coming out? I had that as one of my last questions, but you don't know.
I don't know, man. I mean, listen, at the beginning of 2019, I started getting really clear guidance. It was like God was saying, this needs to be traditionally published.
Mm.
And as I have so many other times with divine guidance, I threw a temper tantrum. And I said, "No, I don't want to do that, God. I don't like that idea.
Uh,
This is my plan. Can you get on board with my idea here?" And the answer was no, no, no. And so I spent a huge portion of time, effectively January through August, or
mhm.
even early September, working on and then redoing a book proposal I don't know how many times. I mean, how long does it take to write a book proposal? Not 8 or 9 months, but it took me that long. It took me, it really, it consumed a lot of me. Anyway, and then I had to find an agent, and I was very blessed that one of my students had an agent. I had already put the proposal out and received the most um, ambiguous kind of response, which is total crickets from everyone I sent it to.
Oh, yeah.
And so then one of my students offered to introduce me to her agent, who is quite a well-known literary agent in the spiritual world. And I said, heck yeah. And she did. And he was excited, and he got on board. He said, we're going places. This is going to be great. And I thought, oh, this is so much fun. And that was last September. So
Okay.
we're still in a process. There's a deep process of surrendering to God here.
Yeah.
And if a publisher picks it up, I'd say probably pretty darn quick, because if no one picks it up, I'm going to publish it myself, because I want the book to get out. And,
yeah.
But more than I want to get the book out, I want to listen to God. So about every week I say, hey, God, do I need to do something with this? And the answer so far is, I've got this. Don't worry. So, okay. So I don't know when the book's coming out. It's a long answer to a simple question, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was curious, because I know that you know, a lot of your communications and stuff like that, you had a book club and you had people reviewing it and all that kind of stuff.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then to use your own words, crickets for the last little while. It seemed like you had quite a bit of momentum, and then it's not happening.
Well, the momentum is still there. It's really interesting, because I mean, the danger with any innocuous question, Rod, is that we disappear down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to try really hard not to do that and let you lead the way here. Okay. So what I will say is that each chapter in the book has opened even and blossomed in my awareness at a deeper level and offered a transmission to me. And one of those book studies is the advanced group, which is ongoing. And we gather once a month and work with the book and explore it and so on. And I can't believe the depth of, I mean, this sounds immodest, but I don't feel like I wrote the book. I feel like I transcribed it. So I've been constantly surprised by the depth of the book and the transmission there. And it continues to open up all sorts of awareness within me, even though I am the author of the book. So
I like that. I mean, I tend to be really practically oriented. Like I want to know, what kind of difference is this teaching making in people's lives? And it sounds like you're working that out with people, with individuals. So you're seeing it firsthand, what impact the teaching is having on people.
Yeah, and I'm having a direct experience of it myself.
Yourself,
I mean,
too.
this is, you know, this is something I've been teaching for a long, long time.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was the intro class, and then it was renamed, but still it was the intro class. And then I wrote about it for a lot of years, and every time I wrote and just went into this deeper and more intimate space with God, I saw more. And then I resisted committing it to paper or virtual or otherwise in any formal way, because I kept thinking, well, I keep seeing new things and I don't want to stop that process. But it hasn't stopped, even though the book is done. It's still living. It's still breathing. It's still expressing.
Sure. Right on. You've been teaching a lot lately about the different levels of consciousness. It's one of your core teachings, and I've really appreciated the videos that you've been putting out. There was one a couple weeks ago about being and awareness just growing the more time you spend in it. But maybe let's start off at a real basic level, and if you wouldn't mind, after each kind of level, just stopping just for a second, I'll see if I have any questions for you. But yeah, what's before we even go into that, just for some context, where did this come from? It seems like it came to you through a transmission or through your own life, or where did you first discover and begin to define these different levels of consciousness yourself?
That's an interesting question, Rod. I think the sense I have is that the stages of consciousness have, um, those books on anatomy where there's a clear page that you turn and then you see the circulatory system and then you turn another.
Yeah,
Do you know what I'm
yeah,
talking about?
yeah.
So it feels like one of those
Hmm.
experiences for me. Like
Yeah,
over time, more of those transparencies are showing up.
yeah.
And the stages of consciousness more sort of filtered in really slowly
Mm,
instead of in some download. So it was more
okay.
about working with individuals and groups and starting to see, and also, of course, looking at my own life
Hmm.
and, and people I know. And I started realizing, oh, it's almost like there's a structure here. Like there's
Mm,
a way of understanding these various stages, and the ability to talk about those stages is really interesting to me if it's not a judgmental dynamic. If it doesn't create, an us and them, or I'm better or you're better or any of this kind of stuff.
mm-hmm.
If it's a
Inferiority, like I'm not at that level, so inferiority, so I'm not at that level, right? So I'm,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
right.
And it's very difficult because there is a progression to my perception that we go through.
Hmm.
And so anyway, you're asking again, it's a simple question. So the answer is it came actually over time,
Hmm.
and in my desire to try to explain these sort of different phases that we go through as human beings, I started naming them. And then the more I named them, the more this awareness started flooding in. And I mean, when I was writing, there's a chapter on the stages of consciousness, chapter 3 in the book. When I started sort of channeling or receiving that chapter, after a couple of days, I was like, there's like 35,000 words. This is way too much for this chapter. I mean, it just kept blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
and so then I had to try to par it down. But, for me, what happens is the more I teach it, the more I explore it, the more I talk about it, the more it distills, the more I embody it, the more it reveals itself to me.
Hmm.
So I may be using the same language that I used years ago, but for me now it's much more distilled, or it's more simple, or I see points of nuance or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So what's the first level?
Well, it's interesting because for years I thought, okay, there are 4 stages of consciousness. And then when
Yeah.
I was writing the book, I was like, oh, there's stage 0. So I
Okay.
didn't realize that. So really there's a stage that we're born into.
Yes.
And I like to call that God consciousness.
Hmm.
And really what I'm just trying to acknowledge there is that every human being that's born has, as part of their innate lens that
Hmm.
they're interacting with themselves and the world, a an active experience of their innate connection with divinity
Mm.
and with everyone and everything.
Whether they know
And
it or not, right? Like it's
yeah,
just
I mean, how does
a
how
very
does a six
very
month
natural
old say that?
awareness. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you've been around, kids, kids are always sharing these points of wisdom. It's like, how
Yeah.
did what do you how do you know that? Where did that
Yeah.
come from?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not just from that. I think there are lots of different perspectives that support that. But anyway, that's the stage 0. We're all
Stage
born
zero.
there. Yeah, it's
Great.
like it's a state of innocence, right? This
Yeah.
really open, sort of beautiful.
Yeah.
There's nothing imposed. It's not something that the child is seeking. They're
Yeah.
just, in it.
There's no trying, there's no drivenness. They're not trying to be something or get to level stage 1
No,
or 2
no,
or
they're
3.
not. They're not trying to accomplish anything. They're just
Yeah.
being who they are, and they don't have any filters. They don't have any, we haven't trained anything. We haven't entrained them to the illusion. They're still living and experiencing it seems it's a problematic phrase in the context of COVID, but what's actually real. From my perspective, what I mean is our innate, undistorted expression of divinity.
Cool. So what's next?
What's next is this fall from grace that I think is described in the Bible in a really beautiful way, allegorically in the description of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. And falling into stage one is really moving into a dynamic of victim consciousness, or I think that's instructive and insightful for thinking of ourselves. But if I say, well, Rod, it seems like you're in victim consciousness, it sounds like a judgment. So maybe another way of thinking about it is an identification with the disempowered separate self. That is a disempowered aspect that feels it is separate or cut off from the divine by whatever name.
Yeah, cool. It makes me think of a person I met at a podcasting event, and she'd written a book, and she'd gone through one of the major fires in San Diego, and their house got burnt down, and 12 people lost their lives in their community. They just barely made it out. And one of her main points, now she helps people that go through similar tragedies. One of her main points is don't be a victim. And of course her solution is some of the stages that we're going to get to next, but it was a really good eye-opening conversation for me, and I could just really see it. Like, what helped her get through was to not be a victim. She felt like she had two choices: to either be a victim, poor me, the government's not doing whatever for me, or having a good attitude and looking at it sort of as an opportunity to start over, still recognizing that there was a sense of loss and all that kind of stuff. But I also see it in recovery and in addiction, and people, a lot of times people, beneath the surface, one of the things that they're struggling with and why they medicate themselves is that they feel like a victim.
Absolutely.
They can't get over blaming others for their situations and for every, So yeah.
Well, the origin of that transition, I think it's important to be clear about is, and I believe victim consciousness is a developmental stage. I don't see it as a weakness or a problem.
Sure.
I see it, in the same way that God consciousness to me is a fact of birth.
Yeah.
Moving into victim consciousness is
it's part of growing up, kind of.
Yeah, and it's influenced by actually experiences of being victimized.
Yeah.
There's a difference between being victimized and victim consciousness. Yeah. Victim consciousness is a narrative wherein everything happening to me is, happening to me, and I have no power and other people have power and so on. Being victimized is very different. And I think when we integrate victim consciousness, we recognize and receive the gifts of having been victimized ourselves and acknowledging and allowing ourselves to feel whatever emotion or physical discomfort is associated with that. And that also then opens a pathway for our compassion and our patience with other people as well, for suffering.
Oh, that's good. That sounds like it has more grace than where I was going with it.
I don't mean it correctively at all, Rod.
I know. No, I'm just like, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. It's more of a compassionate view, that it's transitional, and then also recognizing that, we all have been. We've all been, almost all of us have been victimized in some sort of way, and using the term victim is a legitimate term.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of the challenges associated, I think, with the word is that what constitutes being victimized or what constitutes a trauma. And, I think it's, from my perspective, it's essential to honor whatever that means to the individual, and for us to be able to offer ourselves that kind of presence to our own discomfort, to our own pain,
Mm,
to our own suffering. If we
mm.
can't do it for ourselves, it's impossible to do for others. And if we can't do it for ourselves, then we do get stuck in these patterns that can be very destructive, like, dynamics around addiction and so on.
Yeah. I like that. Like, don't you, I mean, I think the way through is to be present to our own suffering. It's not all just sunshine and flowers and bubbles
Yeah,
and
yeah,
wonderful experiences with God. Like part of the
yeah,
part of transitioning is, and maybe integrating, and the word that you use is to be present to it and some form of acceptance or whatever. Anyways, I don't want to. Yeah, good. I am interested though. This does come up before we go to the next stage. Um, like how do people move through? Like, is it a divine process? Does it happen as you are open to the divine? Um, I'm sure you get asked that a lot. Like maybe more ambitious people wanting to get to the end of all the stages, Um,
sure.
yeah. So explain to us how transition actually takes place.
Well, I think first of all, there's no way to really accelerate the developmental work in any stage of consciousness, even though our separate selves would want that, let's get done. Give me the checklist. I want to get done with this work.
Yeah.
And um, so I think everything is a divine process, even though there's an identification with the disempowered, separate self. The separate self is just another name for the whole self. It's the part of oneself that thinks it has been abandoned or cut off, or is being punished by God or whatever. There are lots of different lenses or flavors of that lens.
Hmm.
But even that, to my view, is held within the divine field. From my perspective, nothing is outside of that. So I see even the illusion of separation as a gift from God. I don't see it as something, outside of divine purview.
Hmm.
And so even though I mean, I think it's a safe claim to make, certainly from my perspective, that the illusion of separation is the source of all pain and suffering. Why would God want to cue that up? Is God an angry God? Well, in victim consciousness, God is an angry God.
Mm.
Or God has rules, or we have, there's all of this. There's a very confined container. So I guess a succinct answer to your question is not outside of God. Lots of profound work associated with that, a
Mm.
lot of which includes not stepping towards God as an open experience, but maybe God with rules, or maybe just a rejection of divinity or God. This is, there's a lot of preoccupation and focus on good and evil in victim consciousness. All of these paradigms exist in stage one consciousness.
Hmm.
So ultimately, I think there are lots of different pathways out of it, but the simple way that I can talk about it with language is it's a function of soul embodiment, first of all, or second of all, and either first or second, also then a function of taking responsibility. Because ultimately, when we are not accepting responsibility for our role in our lives, we're disempowered. But once we do, ta-da, we're empowered. I'm in charge of everything. God's my servant, and now we're dancing to the next stage of consciousness.
Right. So
But that's a really
keep going.
important step developmentally.
That's a good transition into the next stage. Just describe the next stage.
We're going to walk away from the edge of that cliff and not dive off it.
Well, this is so hard. I mean, I feel like we could spend a whole hour or more on. You've been
Sure.
spending years on stage one consciousness.
I'm just getting started.
So, because we have started this process, let's keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the next stage of consciousness I call manifestor or controlling consciousness, and it's an identification with the empowered separate self. So in stage one, God has abandoned me, forgotten about me, is punishing me. I'm separate from myself and separate from others, right?
Mm.
In stage 2, now all of a sudden, magically, God is my servant. God does as I command. I've got a little genie. I rub the bottle and boom, God does what I want God to do.
Mm.
And it's a profound shift. It's certainly an increase in intimacy with the divine. God's no longer over here saying, "What have you done?" God's saying, "Just tell me what to do." And that's a revolutionary shift, and it leads to, you know, all sorts of wonderful gifts, like expressions of perfection, and, you know, the empowered dream, and creating life as we want it to be or imagine it can be, and so on and so forth. Lots of extraordinary gifts in stage 2.
Would you say some of it is like formulas as well? Like, if I do this, then this will happen. If, you know, if I say things a certain way, then God will do this. Is that kind of
Oh,
involved
sure.
in this stage too? Yeah, yeah.
Sure. I mean, the classic example of stage 2 consciousness is the law of attraction, right? It's, you know, I'm going to attract that which I most want into my life.
Yeah.
So if I'm having an experience of victim consciousness, the question isn't how are these people doing it to me? It's what am I doing to attract this experience into my life, because I'm the author,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
Or I'm successful because I held an intention,
Yeah.
which then manifested and became an expression of what I visualized I wanted.
Yeah. So Ken, what are you saying about these things? Because I can imagine you get a bit of pushback with that, because there are people that are very committed to these kinds of
Sure,
ideas, thoughts, right?
sure.
So,
Yeah.
um, and I think sometimes they quote unquote work, you know,
Well,
like,
that's the thing. Each stage of consciousness is totally valid unto itself,
right.
right? We are actually victims, and we
Mhm.
are actually in charge of our own experience. These
We
are
need,
both true.
it's healthy to take responsibility and get things
Unbelievably healthy.
and think certain ways, and it's better to be
Absolutely.
positive than to be negative all the time, kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. And why, if things are just going to happen willy-nilly, why not hold an intention and have the boat head where I want it to head, rather than just be blown around by the storm?
Right. So this model is more it's more of an awareness of this is kind of what's going on. It's not a judgment. It's just to
No.
be aware of where you're at. Yeah. Right.
It's, from my stamp, I mean, if I just strip it down and forget that there's anyone out there that is listening to anything that I'm doing or exploring, and I'm just trying to figure things out for myself, this model is incredibly instructive for me in my own life,
Right.
because I can see, not just an aspect of my life where I was primarily identified with my disempowered self. I can see an aspect of my life where I was identified with my empowered self.
Hmm.
And I've had clients who literally can manifest whatever they want. I mean, they have tens of millions of dollars. They have homes and private jets, and you know, all the things that cotton candy falls out of the sky when they wish it. You know, it's just like it's this magical environment they're in.
Law of
But
attraction's working for them, hey?
the law of attraction is working for them. But here's the thing: in those, the space that I get to witness or be with my private clients,
Mhm.
certainly those that sustain with me, it is an incredibly profound space to really deeply look at things that are unfolding on the interior of our lives.
Mhm.
And, you know, people come to me for a lot of different reasons, but no one sustains one-on-one work with me unless they're in a deep spiritual introspective dynamic, because
Mhm.
that's inevitable through that work that we would be doing together. And one of the questions that I've heard not once or twice, but over and over again from people who are, you know, manifesting magicians or master manifestors, you know, whatever name you want to put on it, is, if I can have anything I want, and I can,
Mhm.
why am I still so unhappy?
Mhm.
Why am I still so unfulfilled?
Yeah.
And these are not comments that people make publicly. And I have no interest in calling anyone out about it. It's not about, haha, I gotcha. It's,
Mhm.
that's real. And the question is, why is that real? And that's really the glass ceiling of stage 2. It's either you get everything you want, but you're still unfulfilled. That's one possible way that we can go. Or you get nothing that you want, or it's a combination of the two. But let's say you get nothing that you want and you're still unfulfilled. And I mean, that's it. Those are the two possible outcomes that we can have in controlling consciousness. And the question then is, well, what do we do with that? What is the answer? And I think that's really the opening to stage 3. That's where the dynamic of surrender comes in. That's where we begin recognizing our relationship with divinity may be inverted in the empowered dynamic, and we subordinate ourselves to God. So instead of God is my servant, it's I am God's servant.
Yeah, great. You're providing great transitions, so just keep going. I don't. I could make all sorts of comments about what you that.
Don't hold back, Rod. I think we should be talking about what's interesting to you, not what's interesting to me.
Well, what's interesting to me actually is the last stage. So I'm trying to get that. I guess that's where I'm going here. And I know you're reluctant to talk about. You're not reluctant, but anyways, I'm looking forward to getting to the stage of union. So
yeah. Okay. So in conduit consciousness, we've surrendered to God, right? But we're in wholeness, but we're still separate because surrender is still happening.
Yeah.
And then at some point we just sort of magically and deliciously move into union consciousness, into stage 4. And stage 4 is a really interesting stage of consciousness for many different reasons, not the least of which is that the only way to have experiences of stage 4 are when these earlier stages are integrated. So, which brings up a really interesting question. How do those things integrate, and to what degree, and blah, 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 right? But basically, if there's an ideal of what union consciousness looks like, it's usually an ideal that's being projected out of stage 2. It's, I think I know what God is like and what God wants from me, so I'm just going to tell God what I think I already know, and that's what union is.
Yeah.
But once you surrender, all bets are off, right? Now I'm turning my life over to God. What does that mean? And what does that involve? And how do I steer the ship? And so there's an enormous amount of work that goes on before we get into union consciousness or even begin having glimpses of it. And even in those glimpses, it's there's a lookalike component to these stages. Victim and conduit consciousness look similar. They feel similar in some ways. There's an aspect of what could be called disempowerment in surrender, and it's really the subordination of the separate self, or the integration ultimately of the separate self. So in union consciousness, what can we say? I guess I'm reluctant to talk about it, and I'm also happy to talk about it. So you lead the way, Rod. What do you want to talk about in union consciousness? What should we explore?
Oh man. I'll tell you what I'm experiencing. I don't know if I can do it without crying, but
Right, brother.
I know.
Let's lay it on the table, man.
Well, it's funny because I've been reading about it for years, and sometimes it's like, oh, is this it? Is this it? Is this it? So, to me, it seems like it's just a more, it's an emptiness. It's kind of letting go of the prior stages, and I'm reluctant to say. I feel like I don't know, like I don't even want to say that I'm circling it or close to it.
Right. I get it.
Maybe a taste of it once in a while might be the point, right?
Sure.
And I think what's interesting is that contemplative people will speak about it, but with the recognition that very few people kind of live at that stage of consciousness, and it has so many. I think the other thing is I'm afraid of it because I feel like, and I know what's going on. I know what's going on, but I'm afraid of it's kind of the fear at every stage. I think is that what I was doing, I kind of need those previous stages to survive and to live, right? So if I let go and go into this next stage, then what's going to happen? Is my business going to fall apart?
Right.
So it takes trust at every level, doesn't it, to kind of
Every
let
level.
go. Yeah. I it's a little bit like snowboarding. Is like I'm a good skier, right? I thought when I snowboard, I'm just going to pick this up like no problem at all. And what I realized with snowboarding is there's a moment of decision where you have to trust that you're going to go from one edge to the next edge. And once I realized that, once I let go, then I could do it. And it got easier and easier. Right. So, and I mean, it's made me cry too, but it's humbling and almost feels obnoxious to say, oh, I'm called to this. Right. But I just keep being drawn and drawn. Maybe a better way to say it is I keep being drawn to let go and let God and more and more and more and more. Right. But I'm afraid. So
I'm right with you.
I still didn't want this conversation to be about me, but I think it's probably helpful for people to see where I'm at and for me to express that, right?
I think it's beautiful. I'm glad it's about you.
Mm.
When it's about you, it's about everyone, Rod. You are called. We're all called.
We're all called. Yeah, that's great. That's a
We're
better
all
way to put it.
called.
Yeah.
God is calling us home.
Yeah.
This process that you've very accurately described as terrifying is
Mm.
about coming home to who we really are.
I love the term coming home. I feel like whenever I have a deeply divine experience, there's an element of it that's like the prodigal son kind of. It's
Yeah.
it's a homecoming. And I go,
Yes.
shit, where have I been for the last year or 3 years, right? It seems like
Yes.
everything sort of falls into place. It is very much a homecoming,
Yeah.
and I never have anything to do with it. It's like
Right.
maybe I put myself in the way of grace. I can think of one experience where I was quite intentionally still, and I had a homecoming experience after that. But still, I wasn't in. I didn't expect it. I didn't think, oh, I'll do this, and then this will happen, right? So, yeah.
One person who I think was in a state of union for much of his experience when I got to sit with him was Thomas Keating.
Sure. Yeah.
And he was in the infirmary at St. Benedict's Monastery at the time. And Brother Chuck was in charge of the infirmary, and he was has been active with the group that I got to go up with. It's just not my group. This is a group that I got invited to participate with that has been going up there for more than 40 years.
Yeah.
And I asked Chuck, do you think there's any chance I could interview Thomas? And he said, well, let me talk to him. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be amazing? And then he came back and he said, well, you know him, don't you? And I said, well, I mean, I've met him, but I don't know him. I mean, there are people in this retreat group who were, the original prior of St. Benedict's was on this retreat group. I mean, I don't know. No, I don't know Thomas the way that probably everyone in this group does. I sat in a room with him some years ago when he came up and talked to us, but yes and no. And Chuck said, okay, let me talk to him. He said, how much time do you want? I said, I don't know, 15 minutes. I mean, if I could have 15 minutes with Thomas Keating, wouldn't that be amazing? And I got to and he wanted to meet me in the periodical room, which is in the private part of the monastery. And so I figured out how to get into the room, and I was bringing my microphone and my stuff, my mic stand in, and he was behind his walker.
Hmm.
And he said, "Oh, hi." And we said hi, and and we sat down, and um, he said, "Well, what do you have going on here?" And I said, "Well, I've got this microphone so that I can record you, and I want to make sure," and blah 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 blah. And he asked me all these questions,
Hmm.
and it's taken. I'm still receiving downloads from him.
Hmm.
But here's the simple example of this.
Hmm.
We're sitting there, and I'm at the feet of a master,
Hmm.
and he keeps looking over at my recording. It's this little thing. It's right here off camera. I would grab it if it didn't knock things over and show it to you. It's just this little piece of electronic equipment that records.
Yeah.
And he kept looking at it. And I'm thinking, I mean, the guy's like 95 when I'm interviewing him. He's not trying to get me to look at that. And finally I looked at it, and the light was blinking because it was paused.
Oh no,
And I
you
went,
forgot.
"Oh," my face flushes, and I hit record real quick. And without dropping a beat, he summarized everything we talked about and moved on.
Wow.
So can you imagine being in such an embodied state of union that at 95, without seeing any visual sign,
Yeah.
that the recorder isn't recording?
Yeah.
And then another example of this is on the way out. It's all done. I'm thinking, I so want to give him a hug. And in that exact moment, he drops his walker and turns towards me and throws out his arms and opens up for a hug, and we embrace.
Wow. Amazing.
So there is someone who is living as we are all called. And I think if Keating were here, he would want to jump in and say, no, don't do that. Don't put me there.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
all here.
what I'm thinking of is one video I saw of him, and how he was talking about he had so many things he was trying to spend more time in prayer because he felt like he had so many more things to let go of. you know, yeah. There's an
Extraordinary.
there is an interesting video or documentary. It's a sort of a documentary about his life, and just to see, where he came from. And he was pretty tough in the beginning when he became the head of the monastery there. He scared a few people away, and but like all of us, he was human, and
he's a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, he had all these pearls. One of them was, we must first be fully human before we can be fully divine.
Mm.
And I was like, can we just, and he's moving on, and I'm thinking, wait, I just want to sit with that for a year. Like, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And another one was, we live in the thinly veiled illusion of free will. There is a nugget. That's an incredible nugget.
Yeah,
he also referred to God as a divine psychoanalyst who's just offering exactly what we need each step of the way. I mean,
the divine therapist. Yeah. Yeah. He says once you start centering prayer, which he was famous for getting out into the world, he says a divine sewer opens up. It's so
exactly.
True.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ken. I feel like we're getting on with time. I could talk to you for a long time. We'll have to.
And you, Rod. Thanks for acknowledging where you're being called to. That was really beautiful.
Okay. Yeah. I hope we can do this again. So Ken's website is kenwstone.com, and there's lots of resources there. Check him out on YouTube. Incredibly, like Ken and I were talking before we got on, and I just said, you're a teacher, man. He's a natural teacher, and he teaches incredibly complex things really well, with a lot of clarity. And I like your drawings. You're taking out the board, and those are.
I have it here in case we got into something. It's right here.
We needed it.
Ready.
Yeah, well, it's really good stuff. And when the book comes out, maybe we'll have to talk again then, or hopefully we can talk before then. But I hope so. Looking forward to that, or looking forward to seeing what happens with that. And let me know.
Me too.
Let me know if there's anything I can do to help with that as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rod.
Right on. Okay, take care. I'm going to just hang on for a sec. I'm going to end the broadcast button and then we can say our goodbyes.
Okay.